Hey guys, Ben from Bachphotography here, and today we're looking at a photo shoot I did with a friend of mine, Emma Jarvis. I'll leave her Instagram in the description below if you want to check out more of her work. And today we were doing a summer-themed portrait session outside in a field, and also by a beautiful blossoming cherry blossom tree as well. So the camera equipment I used today was, for some of the photos, a Sony a7R II, but actually my a7R II was playing up a little bit during this photo shoot, so I reverted back to my second camera, which is a Canon 6D. And this is a great lesson to me of the importance of why you should always take two cameras with you onto a photo shoot, just in case something goes wrong. So the main camera I used was a Canon 6D. I was using a Sigma 85mm 1.4 as the lens, and I've got a bit of a funny story to tell you guys about the Sigma 85 1.4 that I used today. Basically, I was in England doing a wedding, and we were at a church where the ceremony was happening, and the priest there was actually incredibly rude. He was telling me all the things I wasn't allowed to do, how a photographer had to be silent and it was best to be invisible, and I just tried to stay happy and polite and cordial as you do. And it turns out that I actually forgot my Sigma 85mm at the church, which is pretty embarrassing, but because, you know, I stayed nice and played nice with the priest and followed all of his wishes and commands, he actually shipped it back to me, which was very kind of him, so thank you very much if you're listening. Anyway, back to the photo shoot. So this is the first photo that I'd like to show you guys today. It was taken on the Sigma 85 1.4. It was taken at an aperture of 1.4, an ISO of 100, and a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. So didn't use any lighting for this one, it's all completely natural light, and for anyone interested, this was taken very early in the morning, about 1 hour after sunrise, so I think it was about 8 in the morning. And because it was so early in the morning, the sun was nice and low, so the tree was completely shading Emma as well. So this is one of the photos that I took on the Canon 6D while my a7R II was playing up. And I love my 6D, it's my first full frame camera that I've ever had. I got it way before I got the a7R II, and it's what I really learnt my craft on. So let's chat a little bit about the posing I put Emma in. So the first thing I did was I told her to turn 90 degrees perpendicular to me, so she was facing to the side, and then what I got her to do is just put both her hands through her hair and then turn her neck so that she was facing towards the camera. And the reason I did this was, if you contort someone's body up a little bit so you can see their curves better, it makes them look more attractive and beautiful in general, rather than just putting them straight on dead ahead. As well as that, if you have somebody facing away from you to the side and then you make them tilt their face towards you, it shows off the slenderness of their neck as well as the jawline that they have as well, and it makes them look like they have a nice strong jawline, high cheekbones, really gives a strong dynamic to their face and neck. So let's jump into Photoshop and see all the post-production I did on this image. Okay, so first things first, just adding a little bit of clarity to the overall image, just to get some separation from the foreground and the background. Next step, just add some vibrance and then drop down the highlights slightly. Then I also added a little bit of exposure, but then decided to put it back because I like the exposure of the image as it was. Dropped the whites a little bit and then added a little bit of contrast as well. Had a look at what it looked like with a bit less shadows, but decided that it looked pretty good with the shadows it has at the moment. So the next step I did was used the brush tool as a selection tool by dropping the blacks and the exposure all the way down. So now anywhere that I click on the screen shows a big black mark, which is pretty much the way I use this as a masking tool, just to see what I've selected in the image. So here what I'm doing is I'm just highlighting all the bits of skin on Emma's face, just so I can, as a whole, remove any imperfections by reducing the clarity. So I'm just going to fast forward this bit here and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so once I've made my selection, I just get rid of the reduction in exposure and blacks, and then drop the clarity down to a amount that I think makes her skin look smoother but not like a porcelain doll. Next thing I did was I really liked the beautiful purple flowers on the tree, so I decided to up the magentas and the purples, but it was creeping into her face just a little bit, so I decided not to push them too high. The next thing I did was I changed the hue of the greens and the cyans, I believe that was, just to make the greens in the image turn orange and purple, just so they fit in with the tree and the oranges around the tree. The next thing I did was, because I removed all the greens from the image, I had to add the greens back into Emma's eyes. What I should really have done there is do like I did with the first step, make a selection of the parts I wanted to change and then change them that way, but this was just a little bit quicker for the tutorial, so I decided to just add the greens back in separately. Next thing I did was I made the eyeliner and mascara on Emma's face a little bit more bold by just dropping the shadows and the exposure slightly and filling in a little bit more darkness into those areas. After that, reset my brush tool and decided to get rid of some of the purple that was showing up in her eyebrow, and also that was showing up just under her eye as well on her eyelid. Basically the way I did that was I just boosted the color balance of the magentas and greens to the green side and colored it in, so it just got rid of some of the magentas there. So that's everything in Camera Raw. Now let's jump into Native Photoshop and finish the process off. First thing I did in Native Photoshop was make a selection of all the greens and yellow part of the scene at the bottom, which I wanted to change to be orange and purple like at the top. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm finding all the greens and dragging it over to the yellows as well, just so I can make a selection of just the colors I want to remove. I've put the saturation all the way up to 100 just so I can see them better. And then what I'm doing here with the hue tool is just sliding it around, and that's changing my yellows and greens to the color that I wanted. And just played around with that for a little bit until I got the color I wanted. Changing the hue and also changing the saturation and lightness. Yep, so that looks pretty good. Now the whole background is a similar color, and I think it works much better having one consistent color for the background, just so it's not distracting. So here what I'm doing is I'm using the patch tool to remove any blemishes. So I just removed a scar on Emma's cheek, and now I'm going over any of the little blemishes that I can find. Emma's skin is probably the best skin of any model I've ever worked with before, so it was a really easy task just getting rid of any imperfections. So I'm just going to speed up this bit as well because it took a little bit of time and it's just all the same really, so I'm just going to speed this up and we'll move on to the next thing. So the next thing I did was use the liquify tool just to bring the neck in a little bit, just to make Emma's pose a little bit more natural looking. Then I just worked around the scene, changing little bits of her face, just pushing in little bits that were protruding, like the bit next to her lips there, and just going overall around the image and making her look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, just more model-esque and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to speed this section up as well, just because it's pretty straightforward, and we'll move on to the next thing. Okay, so after I did that liquefying, there was a little part of the picture that had just been stretched off the canvas, so I just used the Content Aware Deletion tool just to fill in that piece of the canvas that had been stretched with the surrounding areas, just so it looks all smooth and fluid and you can't tell. So the next thing I did was I made a curves layer and pressed Ctrl I, so I inverted that layer, so it's now a black mask. And here what I'm doing is I'm using the paintbrush just to add some highlights to certain parts of the image. Now this is called dodging and burning. Dodging meaning putting some highlights onto the scene, and burning meaning putting some shadows into the scene. So basically this is a really new technique for me. This is actually one of the first photos I've ever used this technique, and what I'm doing here is I'm just adding little bits of highlights to parts of the scene to make her face really pop and add some dynamics to her face. Here what I'm doing is I'm adding some highlights around her lips because I find that that makes her lips look more full. And I might just speed up this section as well, just because it did take me quite a long time. But basically the idea behind this is you just add highlights to the areas that are already highlighted, and then next what we're going to do is we're going to add shadows to the parts that are more low lighted, and it basically just makes her face more chiseled, it makes her jawline more refined, it makes her cheekbones more refined, and overall just makes her look more beautiful. So now that we've done that, the next step is we're going to make another curves layer, same way that we made the curves for the highlights, and then we drag down so we're making a more shadowy image, and then we press Ctrl I to invert that into a black mask, so then we can just add sections of the low curves or where we want. So the first place I'm doing it is just on her cheekbone, similar to how we'd contour your cheekbones if you were using makeup. So just adding a little bit of darkness there to make her cheekbone look more chiseled and high. Next thing I'm doing here is just adding some more darkness to the lips as well to make them stand out a little bit more. And basically it's the same principle, just find all the areas that are a little bit darker on her face and make them darker. Now here what I'm doing is I'm adding some shadows to the model's eyebrows. And I actually saw this technique on Irene Rudnick's photos, so shout out to her. I might leave one of her videos in the description as well so you can see some of her tutorials. Basically here I'm just making her eyebrows look more full, and I'm just going to speed up this process as well just because it does take quite a while to do this properly. So I'm really happy with how that turned out, and I'm really glad that I learned that new technique because I really find that it adds some depth and character to a model's face. So the next thing I did in this image was I went into the camera raw filter and just added a bit more darkness to Emma's hair. I thought that the hair wasn't quite dark and black enough in this image, and I thought that making it a bit more black would really make her pop from the scene a bit more, especially when you can see how pale her skin is. It would be a fantastic contrast. So pretty much what I did there is I just added a little bit of lower exposure and some darker shadows as well. And that's before and after. I think that really makes her hair look much better. So next step, I just made a selection of Emma. So I went around her whole body, making sure to add a little bit of distance between where her body is, and then went select, invert, and then went to filter blur, Gaussian blur, and added 1.5 pixels, moved the selection over a couple times, added some more pixels in again. So the reason I move the selection over when I blur is just so you don't have a hard line where you can tell where it started blurring and where it finished blurring. And I really think that makes a big difference with adding some separation between her and the background. So that's the final thing. I really hope you like this image, and thank you for sticking around for so long and watching the whole tutorial. Actually, one last thing, I just removed one of the flowers from her hair as well because I thought it was a little bit distracting. So once again, thank you very much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed and subscribe if you learned something. I'll be producing a lot more content like this in the future. So once again, thank you for watching and see you next time.